Hello everyone, this is a video for Q3 Historathon 2025 and also with something that Steve Donoghue had been saying in one of his recent videos. So it's kind of with that in mind, or that as a point of reference. So the first book, and there are only 3 books that I'm going to be talking about in this video, is an interesting book, and here it is. So this is not, oddly enough, a parliamentary book, although splendid and is it finest style or something, but it is in fact, what did it say? The Elizabethan House of Commons. So yeah, quite an old book. The Elizabethan House of Commons by J. E. Neal, the Astor Professor of English History in the University of London. And this was first published in, well, a while ago. Maybe you want to guess. But anyway, yeah. In the introduction, yes, in these days of institutional malaise, a historical study of our English Parliament, though it be of far-off days in the 16th century, cannot be entirely remote from our interests. The past explains the present, and the historical process, so far as it emerges from such a study, has its bearing upon our understanding of contemporary life. Dangerous as the practice is, it helps us in our understanding of history to seize on dates and events in turning points, and Henry VIII's reign, with its religious, social and political revolution known to us as the Reformation, has as good a claim as any to serve in this way. Henry VIII has been called by the master of Tudor history in our time the architect of Parliament. His break with Rome, with all its ramifications, called for legislation on an unprecedented scale. It ushered in the planned state of the Tudors, and it led to a great diffusion of wealth among the landed and legal class. And the legal class is very significant. This is not in the book. As I understand it, in the New Cambridge Medieval, it talks about how there are a lot more lawyers in Northwest Europe than there were in the 15th century than there were in the 14th century, when there was a good many to be found knocking around. So, to continue. Moreover, with the church and conservatism entrenched in the House of Lords, the king, for tactical reasons, had to go into partnership with the Commons and use them as the vanguard of his Reformation attack. We enter the period of parity in power and influence, if not in prestige, between the two houses. By Elizabeth's reign, a balanced history of Parliament would be almost as predominantly a history of the House of Commons as it is in early Stuart times. Already, we perceive the shape of things to come. So I think that pretty well kind of has it, and literally my washing machine is now whirring around in the background. So I may have to redo this, but otherwise I will soldier on, as they say, on literally the beginning of chapter 1, called The County. It says, Elizabethan England, Merry England, no less, was primarily an agricultural community. Its chief wealth was in land, and its ruling class was the landed gentry, the middling and big businessmen of a rural society. So, yeah, I hope to be reading a good whack of this for Q3, definitely. As I understand it, Mr. Neal is, if not a leading, perhaps the foremost, or one of the foremost historians of his age. If you haven't guessed, this book was first published in 1949. And yeah, pretty interesting book. Obviously, it's over 400 pages. An occasional, no, not even occasional illustration. Was one back here. But anyway, there it is, with a very striking front cover. Yeah. Let's not get too carried away. It's not a red book or anything. No. It is in striking contrast, however, to this little number. Yeah. This is by E.A. Smith, part of a series of books, and was published in 1992. So one would hope that this would be the business. I'm not so sure. Yeah. E.A. Smith was reader in history at Reading University. Not a bad university. But he says one or two things that seem to be pertinent. Quote, neither peers nor members of the Commons saw themselves as delegates of or even responsible for their words and actions to any wider constituency. I mean, they are being elected, and they are being elected even in Elizabethan times by a minuscule constituency based on £40 and the like. £40 freehold, I think it is. But still, they're being elected, and technically that would appear to be that they don't have to really pay very much attention. They don't really have to be particularly responsible for their words and actions. Certainly not to any wider constituency. The mass of the people, you might say. And, well, again, technically that would appear to be the case. But of course, life just isn't quite like that. There is the rub of society. There is the social milieu in which people exist and knock about. And the idea that members of the Commons or of the Lords are just simply doing their own thing without any reference to anyone else is I don't think it's going to be exactly the case. It requires a certain kind of perspective and a certain kind of some thinking about what people are really like. Maybe, like in the words of A.L. Rouse, a certain imagination is required. But he continues in the second sentence after that. The independence of Parliament meant not just, as originally, independence of the Crown, but independence of the mass of the people. That's what he says in here. And that is, it would be easy to say, oh yeah, great, okay, yeah, isn't it really terrible? All those lords and ladies and kings and queens, they've got this kind of parliament, but it's just a facade, isn't it? It's just a ruling class doing their own thing, making laws in their own interest, and everybody else is just, I don't know, taxable or something. Oh yeah. He continues. England in 1815 was a country still dominated by the wealth and influence of the landed aristocracy. As opposed to Elizabethan England, when there was something to do with parity in power and in influence, if not prestige. I mean, really? And then, of course, there's Gregory King. Gregory King did a little survey in about 1688. And we have some precise numbers. They may not be wildly accurate. They may not be entirely accurate. They might be, but they're not wildly wrong. But they show just how many members of the aristocracy there are and how many members of the gentlemen of England there are. And there are a lot more gentlemen of England than there are of members of the aristocracy. I mean, what? At the beginning and the end of the Tudor period, there are 25 members of the House of Lords. By the Act of Union of 1707, according to this book, there are 157. That ties in with 1688 in Gregory King in another book. Where is it? It's down here, I think. And then he continues about the numbers of people in the House of Lords. So I understood it from I've completely forgotten the reference. But, yeah, there's about 200 members of the House of Lords before Pitt the Younger's administration and the Napoleonic Wars. And there's about 400 the other side. And he says something like, well, there's still only about 400 members of the House of Lords by about 1880, which rises to 600 by about 1910. And most of these people, certainly of that particular period of time, and possibly, if I read this in detail, a close reading, before 1880, many of them were raised. I mean, he makes the point that somehow or other, miraculously, people are raised to the peerage other than service to the crown. I mean, why would the king or the crown? And they are not necessarily one and the same. I mean, we might have a certain loyalty to the crown, rather than necessarily the king. But that's the point of a constitutional monarchy, presumably. And when I say presumably, I mean depending on the individual and the general accepted consensus, shall we say. But otherwise, yeah, I stopped that quote at mid-sentence by a comma, and it continues. Or I'll just read it. England in 1815 was a country still dominated by the wealth and influence of the landed aristocracy, of which order the peerage formed the pinnacle in rank and social primacy, and men wishing to rise to the eminence had to prove their worth and respectability. Whoops. Well, it says what? Of which order the peerage formed the pinnacle in rank and social primacy. So of the landed aristocracy, the peerage forms the pinnacle in rank. Well, surely the peerage is the aristocracy, and the aristocracy is the peerage. One is a peer of the realm. One obtains a peerage, and therefore one is a member of the aristocracy. So what's he saying? Why is he saying that the aristocracy is the pinnacle in rank and social primacy of the aristocracy? England in 1815 was a country still dominated by the wealth and influence of the landed aristocracy, of which order the peerage formed the pinnacle in rank. Oh, the order. There's an order of landed aristocracy, and the peerage is only part of that order of landed aristocracy. So who's the rest of the aristocracy? Don't tell me it's the gentlemen of England. Don't tell me it's people who actually own some land. All of a sudden they're aristocracy, are they? How the hell are they aristocracy? Are we in France? Do we inherit being a local judge in a hundred or a shire or something? No, no, we don't. No, they're appointed by commission until the Act of 1835. What's it called? The Civic and Municipal Corporations Act, 1835. I think that'll be the one. So, in this book, therefore, there's a direct and specific corruption, a misleading of what aristocracy is. So that should tell you that this is not the case. What this guy is saying in this book is just not the case. Absolute rubbish. It's a little bit outside the range of Q3, being 1815 to 1911, but nonetheless, this is clearly just simply rhetoric or just propaganda. Just a stitch up to say that basically England was run by a small ruling elite for themselves, by themselves. So it's all rubbish, it's all terrible, and all this English history is terrible and wrong and bad. And England had all these kings and queens and lords and ladies and stuff, or other things. No, not the case. Temporal lords, 1688. 160. Total income of group. Total annual income of the group, £448,000. Gentlemen, number of families, 12,000. Total annual income, £3,360,000. Esquires, number of families, 3,000. Total income of group, £1,350,000. Knights, 600. Total income, £390,000. Baronets, 800 of them. Many of them sold during, is it King James or Charles I's reign, simply to raise some money. Possibly because he was trying to rule without Parliament. Not a good idea. Anyway, total income of baronets, £704,000. Put all that lot together as not members of the aristocracy, and you get what? 3, 4, 5, over £5.5 million of annual income. Next to the temporal lords, all of the temporal lords put together, their annual income isn't even £500,000. So who's likely to be more powerful? In American terms, you'd expect the money, the money to tell, the money to talk. Yeah. There's only a very small number of members of the House of Lords. There always were. It only rose above about 200 in the 19th century, and some of them were non-hereditary, and in fact non-hereditary peers had always been a fact of life, particularly in the Middle Ages. And but there's a reason why So, getting back to this book and what he said about this misnomer between, or this misleading line about how the landed aristocracy apparently is a whole bunch of people called esquires and knights and gentlemen. They're all apparently aristocracy. Or what his little fudge, landed aristocracy. Yes. There's a similar use of this in the Middle Ages when we talk about the free and the unfree. And again, there's much play to be had about talking about people in the Middle Ages as just a bunch of serfs. They're all just serfs. They're not free. Not free to do whatever it is. What are they not free to do? You know, and there's all sorts of scope for misinforming people, basically, as far as I can work out. And really, the basic fact of the matter of the difference between free and unfree is a legacy from the past, as far as I can work out. There doesn't seem to be any particular reason for it, except a certain, what would you call it? Kudos. Social status. There's a certain social status about being thought of as free rather than unfree, even if your lives in the same village are almost practically the same. And it would appear as if that is the case. Simply proof of the pudding in manorial court records, people are moving of their own will from being a villein to a freeman, or from a freeman to a villein. Why on earth would anyone do that? Because none of these groups, we're talking about what was called the freemen and also the villeins, and between them they make up the vast majority of the population of England in the Middle Ages. There is a serf population, but they're very minor. Very minor. But what's the difference? The difference is, from my reading of good history books, is the villein, and possibly even the freeman, but certainly the villein, is unfree because he owes services on the land that he holds, probably in the open field system. Whereas a serf, if any exist in any village, owes services to the lord of the manor from his person. He is not free. Therefore, his person, if you like, owes services to the manor. He can't just wander off somewhere else. Oh no, of course not, because he owes services, his person. Whereas a villein, for instance, there is a well-documented case in Leicester where a female who ended up with the family home, sold her family home in a Leicestershire village in the early 1200s and moved into Leicester, the town of Leicester, and opened a pub. Typically enough, because perhaps, whether or not it's because she's a woman, but women seem to have been leading makers of ale in the Middle Ages. That people would stop round to their homes. Perhaps husbands and sons are out in the fields, are working away, whereas perhaps women are more inclined to be in the family home, seeing to the home, and obviously raising children, particularly smaller children. So while they're at home, they're not doing nothing. They might be weaving and the like, and also many of them took to making ale, a nice little extra earner for the household. So it wouldn't therefore be that surprising to find a woman opening a pub in the town of Leicester in the early 1200s in England. But it does, her person did not owe services. She perhaps sold any rights to any land that she might have had in the open field system that had formerly been owned by her husband, and carried that out, that little operation into Leicester. Now apparently she did quite well as well. She expanded, and I think she ended up buying the house next door and expanded her business. I think she may have run a bit of a hotel in the rooms above, and anyway, the point being that they owe services on the land that they rent, not from their person. That's a bondman. That's a serf. And there were very few in England, ever. In Doomsday, from the census, the number of serfs is 2% of the population. Of course, a census at the year of 1086 is not quite as the same as today. I believe they just merely added up males or heads of households. So if any of those serfs had a wife or any children, then they would necessarily be serfs as well, as I understand it. And that therefore the broad estimate from the Academy is somewhere between 2 and 10% of the entire population. But of course, well, there we are. It remains to suppose how many serfs were found a wife in the first place. So yeah, we'll leave it there, I think. But there is a way of misleading people in history. So two ends of it as well, two ends of it, so to speak. There's the landed aristocracy is the peerage only makes up a part of the landed aristocracy. No. I've shown this book before. I hope to read a good whack of it for Q3, basically. But one short paragraph should be material to settle things, hopefully, as a point of reference to what Steve Donoghue was saying about the Earl of Oxford and his Toryism, which of course, well, anyway, I'll read this. In some respects, the period 1688 to 1783 can be seen as one of the workings out of the Glorious Revolution. This was particularly true in the fields of state formation, parliamentary government, political ideology, public finance, foreign and imperial policy, dynastic conflict, and religious politics. And furthermore, links have been made between the radical ideas that were encouraged by the Glorious Revolution and those that inspired, or at least were associated with, opposition to George III in North America in the 1760s and 1770s. In 1783, Britain acknowledged the independence of the 13 colonies that had rebelled in 1775 and declared independence the following year, 1776. This end to the War of American Independence or American Revolution marked a major transformation in the history of the British Empire. So there you have it. What's the material line then? The workings out of the Glorious Revolution. The links between the radical ideas that were encouraged by the Glorious Revolution and those that inspired America in some ways. There's some strong similarities, seemingly, therefore. Partly because the old Toryism that seemingly, I mean, under the premiership of the Earl of Oxford, around about the time of William III and Queen Anne. Or was it Queen Anne? I kind of glanced at it a bit, something like that. That was only a very brief period of time for the Tories to be in power. The 18th century is characterised by the Whigs being in power, and they are rather different to the Tories. The Tories seem to have some peculiar idea of that maybe it was rather regrettable, Charles I being removed from power for some reason, and that perhaps William III and perhaps Anne and so forth should be a bit more Catholic and a bit more kind of absolute and a bit more continental. But no, the Whigs had different ideas, and seemingly England had some different ideas about that, all that kind of thing, and things were rather different. So, yeah. Can we say that England is characterised, as Tocqueville said, by aristocracy? Well, I don't think so. Just on basic numbers, and also basic numbers in contrast to the gentry, the gentlemen of England, and the commons, as Professor Neal said earlier on. Parity in power and influence, if not prestige, was already the case in Elizabethan England, let alone subsequent generations. I mean, does the English Civil War happen without the Commons as powerful and influential and as wealthy as it was? There we are. So, yeah, characterized by kings and queens and lords and ladies, as so many Americans I've heard like to suppose so. There are lords and ladies. There is a House of Lords. Yeah, there is. But they are not dominating the field of politics. They're more like kind of celebs, I think. So, kind of, the equivalent in America is perhaps, I don't know, Waldorf Astor or something. Yeah. So, okay, I think we're going to leave it there. And, well, bye for now.